My mother-in-law died hating me, and the same day we buried her, I took everything she had. My name is Ethan. I'm 46 years old, and I just buried the woman who made my life miserable for 2 decades. But I'm not sad. She died hating me, and I lived long enough to watch that hatred consume the only thing she ever truly loved. Don't let that man enter my room. I don't want his mediocrity to be the last thing my eyes see before I die. Those were her last coherent words, whispered with the little breath she had left, while I stood on the other side of the clinic door. My mother-in-law chose to die alone, rejecting my presence because, according to her, I was never good enough for her daughter. She despised me for my background, for my calloused hands, and for not having a last name she considered worthy. What she didn't know, while she exhaled her final breath of arrogance, was that I already had the keys to her entire world in my pocket. She believed she was punishing me with her final indifference, but the truth is that she gave me absolute freedom to execute my final move. She left this world thinking she had won, but she took to the grave a secret that I personally made sure to plant. The humiliation she put me through for years, right in front of my own wife and my children, has a price, and today, that price has been paid with interest. If you enjoy stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave your like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. Everything began 20 years ago when I met Emily. Back then, I was a young man with more ambition than money, working in a precision mechanical workshop during the day and studying business administration at night. Emily was different. She came from a family that measured a person's worth by the shine of their silverware and the age of their estates. Her mother, Mrs. Margaret Whitmore, was the wall I crashed into from the very first day. I remember our first dinner. She looked at my hands, searching for traces of grease beneath my nails that I had scrubbed until they bled. She didn't say much, but her silence was a whip. For years, my life became a constant attempt to prove that I was worth something. I worked harder than anyone. I stopped being the mechanic and became the owner of a logistics service network that now moves millions. I built a house that surpassed the Whitmore family mansion in luxury. I gave Emily the life of a queen, trips, jewelry, and the security her father, a man who had wasted the family fortune on gambling and terrible decisions, had never been able to give her. But to Margaret, I was still the worker's son. At family gatherings, she ignored me deliberately. She talked about last names, bloodlines, influential friends, and whenever I tried to add something to the conversation, she would simply stand up from the table or ask for more wine as if I were just another piece of furniture in the room. Emily was always caught in the middle. At first, she defended me, but over time her mother's manipulation began to take effect. Margaret didn't use shouting, she used pity and subtle poison. "Your husband is a hard-working man, dear, but he lacks class. He lacks that instinct that can only be inherited," she would say. I would hear those words from the hallway, clenching my fists until my knuckles turned white. I stayed cold, controlled. I knew that exploding would only prove her right. She wanted me to be the animal she imagined, the crude man with no emotional control. So I decided to be the opposite, a block of ice. I became the perfect provider, the husband who never failed, the son-in-law who paid the debts the old woman accumulated through her unsustainable lifestyle. Because that was the great irony everyone ignored. The grand lady of society was technically bankrupt. Her mansion was falling apart from the inside, the pipes failing, the roof leaking water, and it was my checks that kept the facade of opulence alive. She accepted my money with one hand while slamming the door in my face with the other. She felt no gratitude. She believed it was my obligation to pay for the privilege of being close to her lineage. And I allowed it. I allowed it for years because I loved my wife and wanted to keep the peace, but also because, deep inside my rational mind, I was collecting every insult, every look of disgust, every act of contempt. I was keeping a mental ledger of humiliation. Emotionally, I became an observer. I would sit in my chair and watch as Emily slowly drifted away from me, influenced by the daily calls from her mother, reminding her that she deserved something better. The atmosphere in our home grew heavy, as if the air itself were filled with particles of resentment. Meanwhile, I kept growing. My company expanded. I bought assets, land, stocks. I became a powerful man in the market. But at my own table, in front of my mother-in-law, I felt like an intruder. She had that ability to make you feel small with a single gesture toward the waiter, or with the way she corrected my pronunciation of some French wine. It could have been any man in my place. Many would have started drinking, others would have walked away, some would have screamed. I didn't. I dedicated myself to observing the cracks in her armor. I watched as her properties began to be mortgaged one after another. I saw her sell her grandmother's jewelry and replace it with high-quality imitations so no one would notice at the club. She lived on appearances while I lived on facts. That was the fundamental difference between us. She was a shadow of the past, trying to dictate the rules of a present that no longer belonged to her, and I was the owner of the future. I made sure Emily never discovered the full scale of her mother's financial disaster. I wanted Margaret to feel safe on her pedestal of mud. I wanted her to believe that her contempt had no consequences. It's curious how people, when they think they hold moral authority, forget to look at who is holding the ladder. I was holding hers, and I was waiting for the exact moment to let it go. Not out of cruelty, but out of justice. Because there is nothing more dangerous than an intelligent man who has learned to enjoy silence while his enemy slowly hangs herself with her own arrogance. That was the balance before the fall. A successful but invisible son-in-law, a daughter torn in half, and a dying mother-in-law who, even with water rising to her neck, still dared to spit on the only man keeping her afloat. Everything finally broke 6 months ago. Margaret was diagnosed with a terminal illness, and what should have been a moment for reflection or reconciliation became the stage for my final humiliation. She decided that her last days would be her masterpiece of contempt toward me. Despite the fact that my money paid for the best medical team, the most luxurious private hospital room, and palliative care the state couldn't even dream of providing, she issued a strict order. I was forbidden from entering her room. She announced it during a family dinner she insisted on having despite her weakness. She cleared her throat, looked straight at me with those eyes that were already beginning to sink into their sockets, and said, "Ethan, I don't want you near me in my final hours. Your presence reminds me that my daughter had to settle for what was available instead of what she deserved by birth. Stay outside, where employees belong." Emily said nothing. She kept staring at her plate, pushing the food around with her fork. And in that silence I understood that betrayal does not always come in the form of an affair. Sometimes betrayal is the silence of the person who once swore to stand by your side. My wife, the woman for whom I had built an empire, allowed her dying mother to trample me one last time. I felt a wave of heat rising up my neck, but I didn't explode. I simply placed my utensils on the silk-covered table without making a sound. I looked at Emily, searching for a trace of dignity, a defense, but she only reached out to comfort her mother. That was the moment I realized that to both of them, I was still just the intruder with the open wallet. That night I withdrew to my office. I didn't sleep. I sat in the darkness, analyzing the last 20 years. Every time I bowed my head, every time I accepted a sarcastic comment about my working-class parents, every time I paid off one of her late husband's gambling debts to clean the family's honor. The injustice wasn't just the rejection at the hospital, but the plan I discovered 2 days later. While reviewing some legal documents Emily had accidentally left on the table, I found a draft of a will and a separation agreement. Margaret, even from her hospital bed, was orchestrating for Emily to leave me the moment she died. The plan was simple: use my money to save the Whitmore family mansion, put it in Emily's name, and then initiate a divorce that, according to their legal calculations, would take half of my company under the argument that Emily had sacrificed her status to support me. They weren't waiting for Margaret to die to mourn. They were waiting for her to die so they could get rid of the mechanic and keep the loot. Emily had already begun consulting lawyers behind my back, the very same lawyers I had personally introduced her to for her personal matters. The humiliation reached its peak last week. I went to the hospital with a bouquet of flowers, one last attempt to be the civilized man I had always been. At the door, the security guard, a man who has known me for years and whose salary is indirectly paid through my taxes, placed his hand on my chest. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ethan. Mrs. Whitmore left a list. You're not allowed in. She says the smell of your workshop takes away her oxygen." I heard a muffled laugh from inside. It was Emily's sister. Emily stepped into the hallway a moment later. She didn't look me in the eyes. "It's her wish, Ethan. Please don't cause a scene. She says you're not enough to be part of this circle, not even now. Understand that these are her final moments." At that moment, something inside my emotional structure closed forever. There was no anger, no shouting, only an icy clarity. I handed the flowers to the guard and said, "Put them to good use." Then I turned around and walked down the hospital corridor, feeling that every step was taking me further away from the life I had tried to build. I felt light, almost euphoric in my coldness. I had been expelled from their family, from their affection, from their respect. But what they forgot is that I wasn't just the man who paid the bills. I was the man who managed their debts. That very afternoon I called my accountant and my team of auditors. I moved into an apartment I had bought years ago as an investment, one that Emily didn't even know existed. I didn't pack large suitcases, only my documents and the essentials. The symbolic expulsion was completed when Emily sent me a text message that night. "Don't come home today. Mom wants me to stay here tonight and I'd rather keep the atmosphere calm. Don't complicate things any further." I didn't reply. I blocked her number for personal calls and left only the legal channel open. They had taken away my right to be family, so I decided to accept the role they had always assigned to me: the cold, calculating businessman. They wanted class justice, so I would give them financial justice. Emily's betrayal, her complicity with her mother's poison, was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. I was alone, yes, but for the first time in 2 decades, I was the absolute owner of my own moves. I sat at my new desk, facing a window that overlooked nothing, and opened my computer. There was no trace of pain in my hands, only a mechanical precision I hadn't felt since my days in the workshop. My plan wasn't born from impulse, but from basic arithmetic. For years I had been the silent architect holding together the Whitmore family's house of cards. Margaret believed her lineage was eternal, but that lineage was mortgaged down to its very foundations. I called my trusted lawyer, a man who understands that justice is not a scale, it's a hammer when you know how to use it. "It's time to execute the guarantees," I told him. My voice sounded strange, stripped of any trace of affection. The first thing I did was audit every cent that had left my accounts and gone into theirs. It wasn't a personal loan, it was structured investment. For years, whenever Margaret asked me for money to save the family honor, I didn't simply hand her cash. I bought her debt through a shell company. She believed the bank had been generous, but the bank was me. I owned the roof over the house where she was dying, and the bed where she had planned my ruin. With absolute coldness, I ordered the start of the foreclosure process on the mansion. They believed that after the old woman's death, Emily would inherit a property free of burdens. What they didn't know was that the document Emily had seen in my office, that draft separation agreement, had given me the legal motive to activate the default clauses. I met with my mentor, an older man who taught me that in business, as in war, the one who gets emotional loses. He looked over his glasses and simply nodded when I showed him my strategy. "You're cutting off the oxygen, Ethan," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm just stopping the supply." Rebuilding my life didn't mean buying new things. It meant recovering my identity. I went back to visiting my logistics facilities, spoke with my operators, smelled the scent of oil and metal again. I remembered who I was before Margaret tried to convince me that I was inferior. My intelligence had always been my greatest asset, and now I used it to weave a network they would never escape.
Emily tried calling me several times that week, probably to ask for money for a new experimental treatment or to pay the private nurses Margaret demanded with her remaining strength. I didn't answer. Instead, I sent her a formal email drafted by my lawyer, informing her that all corporate credit cards had been cancelled and that the joint accounts were under audit due to suspicious transactions. It was a strategic move to cut off the supplies before the final blow. She replied with messages full of outrage, calling me cruel, saying her mother was dying and that I had no heart. I read every message with a faint, icy smile. They called me cruel for applying the very rules they had written themselves, the rule that I was not part of the family. If I wasn't family, then I had no family obligations. I was simply a creditor, collecting what was owed. I spent my nights reviewing the lease agreements of Margaret's other properties.
She had been illegally subletting them to maintain her lifestyle. I documented every irregularity, every tax evasion she had committed while believing her last name made her untouchable. I prepared a detailed file for the tax authorities. It wasn't an anonymous complaint. It was a delivery of technical information. I wanted the Whitmore name stained, not by scandal, but by financial mediocrity, the thing that would hurt Margaret the most on her deathbed. My patience was endless. I knew Margaret was in her final days, clinging to a life that no longer belonged to her. While Emily cried in the hospital, I sat in my office quietly buying the remaining shares of the medical supply company that provided equipment to that very clinic. By Thursday, I was technically the owner of the machines keeping my mother-in-law alive. It was a delicious irony that only I knew. I could have legally disconnected them for lack of payment, but that would have been too fast. I wanted her to die believing she still had something, so that the blow when Emily woke up to reality would be devastating.
My legal ally brought me the final piece of the puzzle, the record of the jewelry Margaret had pawned and replaced with replicas. He had the original receipts. He had proof that the great lady was nothing more than a white-gloved fraud. My preparation was complete. The counterattack would not be an explosion, but an implosion. I had spent 20 years building their world, and it took me barely 2 weeks to organize its demolition. I was ready for the climax, waiting for news of her death not with sadness, but with the anticipation of an executioner, waiting for the moment to lower the guillotine. My calmness frightened even my lawyer, but I had never felt so clear-minded. Revenge, when it is rational, is a form of art. And I was about to sign my masterpiece. The end came on a Tuesday at 3 in the morning.
I received a message from Emily. "Mom is gone. She's finally at peace. I suppose now you must be happy." I didn't reply. I dressed slowly, like a man preparing for an important ceremony. There was no knot in my throat, not a second of hesitation. My coldness was a shield no one could penetrate. While the city slept, I was signing the final execution orders. They believed Margaret's death would stop time, but for me, Margaret's death was the starting gun. On the day of the funeral, I didn't go to the cemetery. There was no need. Instead, I drove straight to the Whitmore mansion. Emily arrived hours later, still dressed in black, her eyes swollen, and surrounded by cousins and aunts, desperately hoping for a mention in a will that was now worthless. When she saw me standing at the entrance with my lawyer, her expression shifted from sadness to arrogant fury. "What are you doing here, Ethan? You weren't even allowed to see her die, and now you come to disrespect her mourning. Leave right now," she shouted in front of everyone. I didn't move. I kept my hands in my pockets, calmly watching the audacity of the woman who just hours earlier had been planning how to leave me with nothing.
"This is no longer your house, Emily," I said in a voice so low and firm
that silence took over the garden. She let out a nervous laugh, glancing at her relatives for support. "You're insane. This house has been in my family for generations." My lawyer stepped forward and handed her a leather folder. "Ma'am, these are the eviction notices and the property transfer documents in favor of my client's investment firm. Your mother mortgaged this property 3 times. The current owner of the debt, and therefore the property, is Mr. Ethan." Emily's face changed instantly. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her as pale as the body she had buried just hours earlier.
I walked into the house without asking permission, stepping across the Persian carpets I had paid for myself. Emily followed me inside, shouting, begging, insulting me. "You can't do this. This is my mother's legacy." I stopped in front of Margaret's portrait that dominated the main living room. I looked into the painted eyes of that portrait, filled with an importance she never truly had. "Your mother died believing I wasn't enough," I said without turning to look at Emily. "But the truth is, she wasn't enough to maintain her own name. She lived off my sweat while spitting in my face. They expelled me from her hospital room, so today I'm expelling you from this house." The climax of my satisfaction wasn't seeing her cry. It was seeing the impact of the truth. I called the appraisers who were already waiting outside. They began tagging the furniture, the statues, the chandeliers. "All of this goes into liquidation," I ordered. Emily tried to slap me, but I caught her wrist with controlled strength, not to hurt her, just to stop her. "The show is over, Emily. I know about the divorce plan. I know about the will you drafted to empty my accounts. The difference is that I played chess, and you were playing with dolls." I threw her out of the house with nothing but the clothes she was wearing. Her relatives, the same ones who used to look down on me during Christmas dinners, vanished the moment they realized there was no inheritance, only debt. I stayed alone in the enormous empty hall, listening to the echo of my own footsteps. Victory had a metallic taste, dry, perfectly satisfying. There was no need for physical violence. Financial and social destruction had been far more effective. Margaret had taken her pride to the grave, but she left her daughter in the real world, the world of workers and employees they had always despised, but without the tools to survive in it. Watching Emily through the window, sitting on the sidewalk beside her designer suitcases while waiting for a taxi she would now have to pay for with the little cash she had left, was the perfect ending. She looked up at me, searching for a trace of pity, a glimpse of the submissive man I once was. She found nothing. I was no longer the mediocre son-in-law. I was the owner of her past, her present, and her ruin. Moral justice had been served. They wanted me outside their circle, and now I finally was. But I had taken the entire circle with me. I enjoyed every second of her humiliation, not with laughter, but with the sepulchral silence of a man who knows he has put everything back in its rightful place. The great Whitmore lady was now nothing more than an entry in bankruptcy records, and her daughter, the woman who betrayed me with her silence, was now a homeless stranger. Power had changed hands, and this time, those hands carried the grease of a workshop and the strength of a man who would never bow his head again. Today, the silence in my life is absolute, and for the first time, it is a silence I designed myself. The mansion was liquidated in less than a month. I didn't want to keep a single wall that had heard Margaret's contempt. Emily tried to reach out to me, sending emails filled with a desperation she once disguised as pride. But to me, she ceased to exist the moment she remained silent at that table. She moved into a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, working an administrative job that barely allows her to maintain appearances. I've been told she still talks about her lineage, but now people listen to her with the same pity reserved for someone living off faded memories. My children visit me. At first there was tension, but they are young and understand realities, not imaginary bloodlines. I have taught them the value of what is built with hands and mind, not with a last name. They saw how their grandmother despised their father and how their mother allowed that poison to flow. There was no need to give them many explanations.
Bank statements and eviction notices speak a language that allows no interpretation. They know that their security comes from the man their grandmother once called mediocre.
I have returned to my roots, but with the wisdom of someone who has already conquered the summit. I still run my companies, but I no longer try to fit into social clubs where hypocrisy is the price of admission. I surround myself with people who talk about facts, projects, and loyalty. Emily's betrayal and Margaret's contempt were, in the end, the greatest gift they could have given me. They removed the blindfold from my eyes and returned the freedom I had traded for an acceptance that was never going to come. I feel no remorse. Sometimes people confuse cruelty with consequence. I didn't destroy anyone. I simply stopped carrying the weight of people who kicked me while I held them up. If Margaret were alive to see how her name has been erased from the circles she loved so much, she would probably die again from pure shame. And to me, that is true justice. What I feel is not hatred, it is a cold, final peace. I have learned that respect is not earned by paying other people's debts, but by establishing limits that cannot be negotiated. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's watching life collect its debts. It's sitting calmly while those who once believed themselves untouchable discover that without you, they are nothing more than empty shells. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave your like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next stories.